for a long time. I was very angry. I'm not a cop. I'm not a coroner. I'm not the DA. But I had to actually step into their role and do their job. Didn't even want to look into it. It's almost as though she wasn't even a person. I had no idea what I was getting into. And I really went into this absolutely naive. It's been a never-ending saw blade of witnesses, documents, and searching for answers and the truth behind my mother's murder. I did what needed to be done. If I wouldn't have done it, nobody would have done it. This bus has a name. Her name is Sissy Hankshaw. From the book, Even Cowgirls Get the Blues. I love the peace signs that we get driving down the road. There are certain things that make me happy, keep me light, remind me to get out of my head, because you have to live life. My name is Lisa Coppell, and I live in Arvada, Colorado. My mother was born Carmina Coppell in Oakland, California, August 14th of 1930, to a well-to-do family in Berkeley. My mom was always searching for love and never quite found the right love. My mom had several different marriages, resulting in a total of 7 of us children. But eventually it was just my mom, my sister, Paula, and myself. In 1970, Mom moved an 8-foot wide by 24-foot long mobile home up to Stratton Park, Colorado. Where we lived was very rural, very rustic. We had no indoor plumbing and virtually off-grid. In 1972, Mom noticed a pickup truck across the field and spotted a man named Chuck, Charles Leroy Anderson. Mom and Chuck had a whirlwind romance. And on February 12th of 1973, they went and got married. They were only married 9 days, but Chuck was a bad influence on Mom. They drank a lot during the week, weekends. It didn't matter. February 21st of 1973. Mom and Chuck had been at the bar drinking, and they came home pretty drunk. I laid in my bunk and listened to them fight. And I remember him yelling at her, "Look at what you made me do," and screaming at her, calling her dirty and nasty names. And then I went to sleep because it got quiet. Well, a little while later, I'm awakened by one of the neighbors shaking me gently, saying, "Girls, you have to get up. Something's happened, and you need to get dressed, and we need to go." I was guided down the hallway where I had to step over a sheet that was my mom's legs. I knew what death was, but I didn't quite register the darkness that I'd just experienced. We were put into an emergency vehicle, an ambulance. I was 10 years old, so I couldn't really process what was going on. I'm up in between the driver and Chuck asking, what happened to my mom? What happened to my mom? Will somebody tell me what happened to my mom? And they wouldn't answer me. I overheard them call in that there was a 42-year-old woman, Caucasian, with a gunshot wound to her head. Chuck had suffered a bullet wound to his hand. Chuck's explanation of what happened was they were showing the gun to each other, and my mother, she got startled and flipped it in the air and caught it with her thumb, and it just went off in her forehead. When we got to the hospital, we're unloaded, and Chuck is taken into an emergency area, and my sister Paula and I were set on a gurney and told to be big girls about this. They said, your mom has died, and asked if we had any living relatives around that we could contact. Chuck and I didn't speak until the funeral. And he insisted that he didn't kill my mom, it was just an accident. But I couldn't stop thinking about all of the nasty things that I heard him say. It left a lot of doubt and questions. I remember not being happy with certain answers that I was given. Even though the 10-year-old Lisa saw and knew what she knew, the police didn't really talk to me. My mom's death was ruled an accident, and it was case closed. My mom's belongings were put in probate, along with the livestock from our land. Apparently, Chuck was the one who bought my horses. We became orphans and wards of the court. My sister and I both were in the foster care system, going through foster homes. It was a very hard transition, and that's how we started the next part of our lives.
Remember, people used to say, why do you hang out with her? She gets so crazy and angry. And I said, well, she has reason to be angry. Imagine if your life was the way that hers was.
Foster homes and group homes and being flipped around to here to there. And
sleeping in your car, sleeping in the park. I remember when you started looking for your family.
In 1994, I was trying to find family. I wanted to know where I came from, and I made contact with the father listed on my birth certificate, and he wrote me a 15-page letter telling me the details of his relationship with my mom. At the end of his 15-page letter, he had written something to the effect of, am I sure that my mom died the way I think she did? And I started questioning, do I really know? I remembered being asleep in the bed with the covers over my head and listening to them argue and them fight. I don't recall all of the details of what happened that night, but I do remember Chuck screaming at Mom, telling her, see what you made me do. Look what you made me do. Calling her a bitch. I wanted to find out what the police report had to say about how my mom died. I'm not a trained detective. I'm not a PI by trade, but I'm kind of like a pit bull. Once I get on it and I latch onto it, I'll hang on until the bitter end.
True.
And I find all of what I'm after. The end of his 15-page letter sparked something in me. I needed to find out the truth to what happened to my mom. I started by getting the police report. It was a 3-inch thick file with tape on it, red tape, case closed tape. And they cut the tape right there in front of me and took the police report out, and they made me my copies. I had to take several days to read it through the first time to start making notes. So this is the first version that Chuck gave regarding how my mom died. How does this make sense to an officer? Somebody that knows firearms doesn't make sense. In the police report, there were 3 versions of what Chuck told the police. In the first one, she was drunk. So he had to take the gun away from her, and he had grabbed the barrel of the gun, and the gun went off accidentally. In the second version, she got startled and dropped the gun, and it just went off from the floor to her forehead. And then the third explanation was that he had to go to the bathroom and went outside. And when he came back in, she was posed with the gun in her hand. And Chuck alluded to my mother committing suicide. I was at my wit's end and felt I had no direction to go. It disgusted me to know that Chuck was living his best life in the bars with no accountability. I tried to block it out, but Fort Collins was a small town. There were a couple of times where our paths would cross, and I chose to look the other way. I chose a different avenue. I thought maybe I should go ahead and do some actual investigation. And so I began contacting people. I broke down a list of witnesses, sheriffs, DAs, and I set forth to contact almost everybody on those lists. I started with the coroners. One of the people I contacted was Dr. Agura, and he was very engaging and said he remembered my mom's case. He said that he remembered having to do a second autopsy on my mom. There was disagreement on the angle of the gun and whether or not it was her hand on the gun at the time it was fired. And he said the second autopsy was a considerable difference in opinion from the first autopsy. The angle of the first autopsy was not even plausible with Charlie's versions of the story. He was adamant that the first one had been botched. But a panel of 6 professionals decided that the differences in angles wasn't something that needed additional investigation. They were going to rule Mom's death as an accident, case closed, and they thought everything was done until I came around asking questions. I wanted to know what was in that second autopsy. So I called the coroner's office and I asked for them to take a look at this file again. They couldn't even find the file. There was nothing. It was referenced to a miscellaneous file, but the file was empty and had been for years. And it felt like they just covered it up. There was no headway there. After the coroner's office, I stopped at Old Chicago and thought, you know, I'm gonna have a drink, and it's a bartender's job to listen to my woes. I was just pissed. You know, I left the coroner's office and they don't show any records, you know. Oh, well, we don't even show we did this case.
My name is Diane Fairman. In 1995, I was bartending and Lisa came into the bar and sat down kind of at the end of the bar and just seemed a little distraught and upset.
I began to tell her a brief rundown of my mom's homicide. I needed to find the truth and the answers.
Sometimes people come into bars and they have tall tales. There was just something about you. I just listened and got more and more intrigued, and then when you said it was all in Larimer County, I'm like, oh.
Well, guess what?
I said, well, strangely enough, I just happen to know the person you need to talk to because I'm interning at the coroner's office in Larimer County.
Here I am, looking to get some questions answered, and here she's an intern at the coroner's office. I couldn't believe it. Look at it how you will. I have no doubt that Mom sent me to Old Chicago that day.
I went back and I just said, her story sounds very plausible, and I don't see, even as an intern, that this case doesn't deserve a second look. It just doesn't sound like it could have happened, you know, the way they're saying it happened. I realized who she needed to talk to. It would be the chief deputy coroner of Larimer County. When I went back to the office, I told him that I had met this woman, and she seemed very compelling and very honest and had some interesting facts to tell him, and that he needed to listen to her. And he did.
The Larimer County coroner called me back and said that they found the documents, which included the second autopsy. I was hoping maybe the second autopsy would have the truth and the answers. Lo and behold, it changed everything. Once they found the second autopsy, I made contact with Fred Rosenberg. Fred Rosenberg was an investigator for the Larimer County Coroner's Office. He compared both autopsies and did a skull diagram showing the bullet path. Fred said that the first autopsy wasn't as accurate as Dr. Agura's. It left a lot of doubt and questions. Fred wanted to go over this with me and asked if I could come in. So I went to Fred Rosenberg's office, where he gave me copies of all notes, all reports. It was very difficult initially to view the death pictures. I was saddened that that's now how I'm gonna remember her. But I needed to step out of the 10-year-old Lisa and step into the investigator Lisa. It's all the same person, but it's two completely different roles. That's the only way I've gotten through this.
Fred took the paperwork and all of his sketches and his analysis, and he took it to Dr. Allen, who was the chief medical examiner at the time. Dr. Allen looked at it and agreed wholeheartedly with Fred that this could not have happened the way the first autopsy says it happened. And it definitely was an investigation that needed new ballistics.
The chief coroner reviewed all of the documents that Fred had showed me. However, they did not have the gun because the sheriff's office purged evidence from their evidence room in 1978. Back then, the case wasn't a homicide. So they sold the gun in a big gun auction. So I set out to find a similar gun. I wanted to know the length of the barrel, the length of the handle with the cylinder, and how big the gun was. I had gone to the local pawn shops and traced an H&R single action 22 revolver, and this is what I got. I had to disprove all of Chuck Anderson's stories. In the beginning, Chuck was saying that the gun went off accidentally. Well, the angle of entry in that second autopsy was above her ear and kind of to the back of her head, which couldn't have happened unless the gun was behind her. So I looked in the mirror and I held the paper gun up, and I'm like, there's no way her hand could have been on the gun with a 6-inch barrel. Her wrist would have been broken. The angle disproved almost all of his versions. The gun falling to the floor, or him taking the gun away from her by the barrel, and it wasn't suicide. Her hand could not have been on the gun at the time it was fired, period. I went in and role-played to prove that Mom's hand could not have been on the gun at that angle. It couldn't be. I showed Dr. Allen, and he agreed with me. Her hand could not have been on the gun without her hand being contorted.
Fred and Dr. Allen and Lisa had, I think, several meetings, and Dr. Allen ultimately had enough evidence in front of him that he was able to say, this isn't an accident.
Within a couple of days, Patrick Allen had signed the death certificate to read suspicious for homicide, which is huge, huge, huge. Nobody gets a death certificate changed. It's terribly hard to get a death certificate changed. Finally, there's acknowledgement that I'm not the only one who believes that he killed her. And it's in writing. It's official. What a feat. What a feat. Now, is the sheriff's office going to work on opening the investigation? When the coroner signed the death certificate, I'm thinking, all right, they'll reopen the investigation, it'll go to trial, and then I'll have justice, and there'll be justice for my mother. Absolutely, I thought that they would see what the coroner saw, but they didn't. When I spoke to the sheriff's investigator, he told me that he had interviewed Chuck Anderson recently and that he believed Chuck's explanation in the original police report. And he told me the case was going to be open but inactive until there's new evidence. He wasn't going to work the file anymore. Another brick wall. I couldn't come in and do it for them, but I could get some more answers on my end. I continued to talk to people. I was up near Horsetooth, and I stopped to buy a lighter. And I go in, and who's standing next to me but Chuck? Counting pennies for a pack of cigarettes.
You hadn't seen him in all those years?
Hadn't seen him. Didn't want to. But there he was, ruining my day. He didn't see me. So I got my lighter and I got in my little minivan and I sat in the parking lot and I shook. Oh my God, did I shake. Did I run him over? What do? Do I follow him? What do? I watched him go into a bar. And so I walked in. I walked right up to him, and then he announces to the bar that I'm his long-lost daughter for haven't seen me for years and this and this. And I said, there's an empty table back there. You and I, back there now. And he came and sat down with me. I listened to his story of where he put my mom's ashes. And I knew it was a lie because Chuck bragged at the bars that he took my mom's ashes and threw them into a garbage pit next to his pig pen. Eventually, I told Chuck I wanted something of my mother's, anything. And so we went back to his house.
Must have been chilling, right?
It was chilling. But I know he's not gonna kill me. I'm too friggin' mean. We sat down and he opened his little file drawer and pulled out the deed to Mom's land. He held on to it like a frickin' trophy. Of course, it had been sold in probate, you know, no value other than that was a piece of paper that was in her purse, and I got it back. And he didn't get to keep the trophy. After seeing the deed to the land, I started questioning if Chuck's motive was a monetary value. I don't know, maybe he wanted to try and get her livestock, her land, and it was all about the money. They weren't together for love, that's for sure. Several people had made mention that Chuck wanted to take a life insurance policy out on her, which started a big fight in the bar, because he wanted to be the beneficiary, and Mom wanted Paula and I to be the beneficiary. They were only married 9 days. So she really got uncomfortable and really regretted marrying him and really wanted out and wanted him to go away, but he would not go. I had Chuck Anderson's motive, but it felt like it didn't matter. We can never hit the DA if the police don't do their portion. That's it. It's as far as we go. I'm questioning, will we ever see whatever justice is? Chuck Anderson took everything from me and took everything from my sister Paula. All the things that Paula endured in her years of placement and my mom's death, it even went as far as Paula committing suicide. She was a very troubled person and saw no other way out. I will always think Chuck's responsible for that. In 2001, I was working for a gun scope company, and somebody made mention that they had seen an article written about my mom's death. And in it, they too alluded to suicide. And that was one of my biggest peeves. So I called the Longmont Daily Times and I asked for them to do a retraction. And I waited 7 months before I just had it. And I went into the Longmont Daily Times and I ran into Dee Dee Corral.
There are certain details that I do remember very well.
Right.
Like you storming into the paper, wanting to...
For me, it was, I'm dialing direct.
It's not uncommon for a newspaper to get people coming in who are unhappy with something, and sometimes there is not much to their claims. And in this case, Lisa was fired up, but she also had all the documentation to support her grievance that the word suicide had been used.
I don't mind doing an article on my mom, just make it factual. Mm-hmm. Because if I die, somebody's gonna look at this and say, it was suicide.
I would feel the same way. I went through all the reports and corrected some mistakes made in the coverage. And actually, in looking back at my notes, I noticed there were a number of contradictions in Charles Anderson's statements against what I knew was in the police reports. The story would not be complete without his version. We had to make the effort to try to talk to him.
I remember you were going to go up there. I said, don't go out there alone.
I didn't have anyone available at the paper that day to go with me, so I got my dad to go with me. When I arrived, we had some concerns about Mr. Anderson. He had stickers on the outside of his door, making sure that everyone knew that he had weapons inside, but we had to make the effort. Mr. Anderson was drinking a beer and watching a show on TV. I think it was The Golden Girls. He invited me in, he was friendly, and he seemed willing to talk. And so I started off by asking him just some questions about the case. Immediately, he began to say things that contradicted what was in the police reports. And finally, at some point, just said, what happened? How did she die? How did she get shot? And that was where he looked up, he looked at me, and he said, well, she didn't shoot herself.
I remember you calling me back. Lisa, you'll never believe it. He said that her hand wasn't on the gun at the time it was fired and that she didn't shoot herself.
It was very chilling to me. It was just very direct. What he was saying to me was that he had shot her. It was, to me, a stunning admission. As soon as I left, I called up the sheriff's office and I said, listen, here's what he said to me. and what's your comment? And the lieutenant said, well, I'm not going to tell you my comment based on what you just said. I'm reopening the case.
It's not appropriate for me to judge maybe what wasn't done in the past. I wasn't around in 1973 as far as police work. But in the 2000s, when it came up again with Dee Dee Corral from the Longmont Times call, I was surprised and maybe a little skeptical at first, you know. Okay, this is the media calling to tell me something. I was intrigued by what Dee Dee had to say because he was making a statement he'd never made before, and that changed everything. Here's the evidence to explain inconsistencies with the story that Nina had pulled the trigger herself. It seemed at the time that he was a bit brazen, and he'd gotten away with it all these years.
He bragged in the bars all these years.
Yeah.
But nobody ever reported it.
Right, right. We had information that might finally make a difference. So we were able to put an investigation together, and I assigned the case to investigator Robert Coleman. And he began to look at the case again with fresh eyes.
My hopes were very high that Bob Coleman was going to be able to do this. So I met with him, and I got his file back up to speed. And I was really, for the first time in years, feeling that I would get justice.
Robert Coleman was pretty renowned as a very good interviewer. He was the best interviewer we had. So the key in this case was for Investigator Coleman to bring Chuck Anderson into the office, into an interview room that we could control, to prove that his story, his narrative wasn't right.
Charlie?
Yeah.
Bob Coleman, how you doing?
Thanks, Bob.
Nice to meet you. This is Ernie Hudson.
Pretty good. God bless the VA.
Because this case had so many different versions, it was important to start broad and narrow down to those facts that were disputed, and ultimately the fact of who had their finger on the trigger.
As soon as I got the door open, walked in, I seen her, and I saw her pulling the trigger.
No kidding.
In the course of the interview, there is a point where Under Sheriff Hudson explained it couldn't have occurred in the ways that you had described in the past, and here's the evidence, and here's the evidence.
The gun didn't go off by itself.
No.
You had possession of the gun before she was shot, Charlie. You had possession of the gun.
The detectives told me that Bob Coleman had spent 5 hours interviewing Chuck Anderson. They had put up a whiteboard outside the room, and every time they got him to disprove a version of one of his stories,
I'll get you some more coffee, Charlie.
they would go outside and check it off the whiteboard.
There is only one truth, clearly, and that made the ultimate difference in this case. There was only one truth, and he had to come to it, leading him to a point where he quietly says, "You're right."
What happened that night?
I pulled the trigger, but it was like I was helping her commit suicide. That's what it felt like to me.
Why did you think you were helping her commit
She
suicide?
had talked about it.
But you shot her.
Yeah, I did.
He finally admitted that he shot Nina.
I think we've come so far today. Charlie, what do you think?
I feel like somebody took a big something off my shoulders.
Chuck Anderson had spent years lying about what he had done, but I felt for the first time vindicated. It was actually the 30th anniversary of my mom's murder. The DA's office said that they had enough to go forward with an arrest warrant, and I never thought I'd see that. I remember the detectives called me to let me know that right now, as we are speaking, they're placing the handcuffs on Charles Anderson for the murder of my mother. I could hear the sound of the cuffs clicking, and I cannot tell you how elated that made me. he didn't get away with it. And that was the most beautiful thing. After all those years, it was actually going to make it to court. We went into court, and Chuck actually had 3 lawyers that went into court with him. I knew that he would fight to get it dismissed, and I just want him to spend some time in jail.
It was almost like this was the last shot at a successful conclusion. But I knew we had evidence that he couldn't run away from. Justice needed to be served regardless of the time that had gone by.
I'm feeling that this is really gonna go somewhere, and the next day the whole bottom drops out. I got a call from the district attorney's office saying that they were going to offer him a plea bargain. They charged him with second-degree murder, and they were going to allow him to plea bargain to manslaughter. The laws applicable in '73 were not the same as in 2003. So they had to use the laws that were applicable in 1973, which gave a lot more good time credit. They were less restrictive in sentencing. And they were telling me that they were going to offer him a 1-year sentence.
Because the case was now decades old to the district attorney's office. They didn't have what you need to get a good, strong, long sentence. Then they just end up settling for what you can get.
There was a possibility that it would be thrown out of court and we would have never been able to take it back. So I had to be thankful for what I got. It sickened me, but it's what we had. I think in the end, I wanted him to say he was guilty. I wanted him, for the first time in his life, to own that he killed my mom in an open courtroom, to the judge and me in the courtroom. August 14th was my mom's birthday. The next day, we went in the courtroom for his sentencing, where Chuck was supposed to say, guilty, in order to get the 1-year sentence. But he stood there and he said, nolo contendere. I couldn't believe it. Nolo contendere means no contest. And everybody in the courtroom gasped. The judge said, I'm going to take that plea as a guilty plea based on the agreement that you reached with the district attorney's office. But it was just insulting. With time served while we were waiting to go to court, by the time they actually got him down to 4 Mile Correctional Facility, he only spent 5 weeks imprisoned. After Chuck got out of prison, the people in his hometown didn't want him around. He had difficulties finding people that accepted him. And a few years ago, he died. And it was a relief to know that Chuck's no longer on the streets and he can no longer hurt anybody.
Quite frankly, you presenting your evidence to them the way you did was a key component. You were the driver all that time. You're a hell of an investigator.
Thank you.
You're a hell of an investigator.
You were my ally.
I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you.
I dislike the word closure because there's so many open wounds. There's answers. There's time that passes that helps make things a little easier. But there's no closure. There's still the gaping hole of missing the person that you loved. It never changes. It doesn't go away. I'm glad that I got done what I got done. It's huge, really. It's monumental. I had the truth on my side. I had my mom on my side. I felt she was there, and I got to say what she couldn't say. It was the gift that I could give her. And I believe that she watched it all. And I know she's proud of me, which makes the 10-year-old Lisa happy to know Mom's proud. When the coroner signed the death certificate, I'm thinking, all right, they'll reopen the investigation, it'll go to trial, and then I'll have justice, and there'll be justice for my mother. Absolutely, I thought that they would see what the coroner saw, but they didn't. When I spoke to the sheriff's investigator, he told me that he had interviewed Chuck Anderson recently and that he believed Chuck's explanation in the original police report. And he told me the case was going to be open but inactive until there's new evidence. He wasn't going to work the file anymore. Another brick wall. I couldn't come in and do it for them, but I could get some more answers on my end. I continued to talk to people. I was up near Horse.
Tango to extinguish cigarette smoke. Suddenly I miss you and my heart aches. He searched for folk songs. Warsaw, Warsaw. Send you red roses. Sending you my kisses and my nostalgia for home.
Into a garbage pit next to his pig pen. Eventually, I told Chuck I wanted something of my mother's, anything. And so we went back to his house.
Must have been chilling, right?
It was chilling. But I know he's not gonna kill me. I'm too friggin' mean. We sat down and he opened his little file drawer and pulled out the deed to Mom's land. He held on to it like a frickin' trophy. Of course, it had been sold in probate, no value other than that was a piece of paper that was in her purse, and I got it back. And he didn't get to keep the trophy. After seeing the deed to the land, I started questioning if Chuck's motive was a monetary value. I don't know, maybe he wanted to try and get her livestock, her land, and it was all about the money. They weren't together for love, that's for sure. Several people had made mention that Chuck wanted to take a life insurance policy out on her, which started a big fight in the bar, because he wanted to be the beneficiary, and Mom wanted Paula and I to be the beneficiary. They were only married 9 days. So she really got uncomfortable and really regretted marrying him and really wanted out and wanted him to go away, but he would not go. I had Chuck Anderson's motive, but it felt like it didn't matter. We can never hit the DA if the police don't do their portion. That's it. It's as far as we go. I'm questioning, will we ever see whatever justice is? Chuck Anderson took everything from me and took everything from my sister Paula. All the things that Paula endured in her years of placement and my mom's death, it even went as far as Paula committing suicide. She was a very troubled person and saw no other way out. I will always think Chuck's responsible for that. In 2001, I was working for a gun scope company, and somebody made mention that they had seen an article written about my mom's death. And in it, they too alluded to suicide. And that was one of my biggest peeves. So I called the Longmont Daily Times and I asked for them to do a retraction. And I waited 7 months before I just had it. And I went into the Longmont Daily Times and I ran into Dee Dee Corral.
There are certain details that I do remember very well.
Right.
Like you storming into the paper, wanting to...
For me, it was, I'm dialing direct.
It's not uncommon for a newspaper to get people coming in who are unhappy with something, and sometimes there is not much to their claims. And in this case, Lisa was fired up, but she also had all the documentation to support her grievance that the word suicide had been used.
I don't mind doing an article on my mom, just make it factual. Mm-hmm. Because if I die, somebody's gonna look at this and say, it was suicide.
I would feel the same way. I went through all the reports and corrected some mistakes made in the coverage. And actually, in looking back at my notes, I noticed there were a number of contradictions in Charles Anderson's statements against what I knew was in the police reports. The story would not be complete without his version. We had to make the effort to try to talk to him.
I remember you were going to go up there. I said, don't go out there alone.
I didn't have anyone available at the paper that day to go with me, so I got my dad to go with me. When I arrived, we had some concerns about Mr. Anderson. He had stickers on the outside of his door making sure that everyone knew that he had weapons inside, but we had to make the effort. Mr. Anderson was drinking a beer and watching a show on TV. I think it was The Golden Girls. He invited me in, he was friendly, and he seemed willing to talk. And so I started off by asking him just some questions about the case. Immediately, he began to say things that contradicted what was in the police reports. And finally, at some point, just said, what happened? How did she die? How did she get shot? And that was where he looked up, he looked at me, and he said, well, she didn't shoot herself.
On April 29, 2019, a young man disappears without warning.
He was well respected, well liked, and had a wonderful network of friends. So he had all his life to live for.
We weren't looking at an 18-year-old lad who just stayed out too late. There was something more to this.
A rural community rocked by a gruesome murder.
The superintendent rang me and said, we've found a body.
They were unable to actually identify not just who it was, but whether it was male or female.
He had over 146 different injuries to his body.
In my career, I can only think of a couple of cases where I've seen injuries that come anywhere close to that.
A race against time to catch the killer.
Was he going to do it again? They could have been looking at a serial killer here.
I need to protect the public from this monster.
It seems like a real contradiction to have such a gruesome, awful scene in such a beautiful, picturesque location.
Parbold, it's quite an affluent little village just outside Skelmersdale. Really quiet, nice people, very rural. It is a lovely area.
Population of about 2,500 in a wonderful village setting with its pubs, its shops and its church.
There's a little railway station. It's very quaint. It's what you think of when you think of a village in the northwest of England. There's a really low crime rate in that area. I mean, you get the occasional bit that's flown over from the bigger cities because it's between Manchester and Liverpool, but really it's quiet. People like it for that reason.
You don't expect any issues, any trouble, let alone a murder to happen. It's that one place that you would always see on the television when locals were interviewed and they'd say, well, we'd never expect that to happen around here.
But on April 29, 2019, a young man went missing under unusual circumstances.
The first I heard about this case was when the police put out a missing persons appeal. It seemed a little bit odd because quite often when 18-year-olds don't go home, they don't reach the point of media attention because 18-year-olds, you know, it's not that unusual for them to stay out overnight or whatever. But we heard about this case, this appeal for Alex, and you just get a feeling about things.
The missing person was 18-year-old Alex Davies from the nearby town of Skelmersdale.
Alex worked in Home Bargains and he was doing really well there, and he just recently got promoted. He had a really good social life. He had a lot of close friends, and growing up for Alex wasn't easy. He stood out.
He realised at an early age he was gay, but of course when you're very young, the word that comes to mind is different. I was different in some way, where all it was his sexuality.
Children can be cruel and they can pick out when children are different in some way. Now, for Alex, he liked to do train spotting. He would often go with his friend looking at trains. He liked ABBA, and he was open about the fact he was gay. The sort of things that children can focus in on, and he was picked on for standing out.
Alex, however, had done really well for himself. He'd showed resilience. He'd got through that time in his life. He was openly gay as an adult. He was working hard and doing really well.
Alex was so comfortable in his own skin that he really didn't care if people liked him or not. He was just going to be himself and people could think what they liked.
Very friendly. He would approach people. Often, you know, it was said by some of his friends, he didn't have filters. You know, if he liked somebody, he would go and ask them for it on a date, you know. Carefree, life-loving lad.
Alex had a great group of friends. They described him as lively and happy, and he would see them really often.
Like many boys of his age, Alex was into cars, so he liked to drive around late at night out listening to music. He was even known to pull the odd donut.
He'd pick his friends up, he'd drop them off at home if they were on the same shift, or, you know, he'd go and pick them up and they'd have some music on, they'd be singing and joking and just having a fun time of it.
He was really there for people, and when you hear people talking about what Alex was like as a person, that really comes through, that he was there for people.
Everybody said that he was one of the nicest guys that you could ever meet.
He was well respected, well liked, and had a wonderful network of friends. So he had all his life to live for.
The last time that Alex met up with his group of friends was on the Friday night. They had drinks, they did what they would usually do, but sadly they didn't know that when they said bye to him that night, for many of them, that would be the final time.
On Monday, 29th of April 2019, Alex's mother, Beverly, returned home from work to find that Alex had not come home.
The kind of relationship that Alex had with his mum, they were really close, and it would have been really unusual for him not to be in contact with her. When she came home that night, 9 o'clock, and she hadn't heard from him all day, she started to worry. She had those mother instincts that it's not quite right because this is out of the normal. I would have heard from him by now.
There were no secrets, so she would know where he'd be. A lot of relationships like that, you can set your watch. You know what's going to happen, where people are going to be. So she was very surprised that he wasn't there and he didn't turn up at home when she was at home. And when you know somebody, whatever age they are, you know that's out of character. So straight away, his mother was concerned, worried, and a bit bamboozled about what has happened to Alex.
Beverly grew even more concerned as it drew closer to midnight on Monday and there was still no sign of Alex.
Alex's mum was starting to get really worried now, and as you would expect, she started to phone around his friends.
Obviously hoping that there was a really simple explanation that perhaps he got caught up in things, his phone had no battery. But as she was ringing through, it soon became clear that none of his friends had seen him since the Friday.
Then one particular friend, Leon, when he said he hadn't heard from Alex, that really started to worry her because that was unusual.
Leon had seen him on the Sunday at work, but he'd not seen him at all since then, and for both of them not to have seen him, something was really wrong.
The following morning, when Alex still wasn't home, she was more worried than ever, and that was when she decided to phone the police.
Unfortunately, perhaps as might be expected, it wasn't treated as high risk. Alex was an adult. It was suggested that give it some time, see what happens.
Then it was a case of, well, he'll come back. He may have just been staying at a friend's house. So police don't sort of take it lightly, but they don't take it seriously in a sense. So therefore, as a parent, you feel that you've been let down, that no report's been taken, they're not going to do anything.
I think it's a mother's instinct. You know your children, you know your patterns, you know what to expect, and when something's not right, it's just a feeling, and it's not something you can describe. It's powerful.
Alex's friends and family did not want to waste any time, so they began their own appeals for help.
His friends took to social media to try and raise awareness that Alex is missing, asking for information that anybody had of him. Had they seen him? Do they know where he is? And that included Home Bargains, where he worked. They used their own Facebook page to put out an appeal for information as to where Alex might be.
Alex had previously been confronted by a group on his way to work, so one of his friends was worried that perhaps he'd been picked on, perhaps he'd been attacked. They must have been thinking the worst.
Beverly downloaded the CCTV footage from her front door camera and made an interesting discovery in the recordings from Monday 29th April.
Alex got a taxi from outside their house, and on the CCTV she could make out the registration number that she could trace back to the cab firm.
So the next thing you'd automatically do as anybody, let alone a parent, is to ring that firm and say, look, I'm worried about my son, can you please tell me where that taxi actually took my son?
It turns out that he was dropped off at the station in Parbold, which is about 10 miles away from where he lives.
There were no indications that Alex was alive, moving around, doing everyday things. And this would have started to raise the concerns of the police and raise the risk against him.
Police began their search for Alex by scouring CCTV footage in Parbold, where he had taken the taxi to on the day he went missing.
There was CCTV in and around Parbold train station, which showed Alex turning up in the taxi, getting out, carrying a rucksack, and he went into a shop and he bought a can of pop and bar of chocolate. They were able to track Alex's route using different CCTV cameras that were available, but only to a certain point. Because this was now a rural area, the camera footage stopped, the coverage stopped. So some distance away from Parbold station, they knew that Alex was walking towards a more rural area.
From that point on, the trail went cold. There seemed to be no more evidence of Alex in the area. The police and family members had reached a dead end in their search for Alex.
And as the days went on, it became more and more concerning, really, that, we weren't looking at an 18-year-old lad who'd just stayed out too late and not gone home when he was expected. There was something more to this.
But everything changed when the inevitable call came on the evening of May 1st.
I'd finished work, gone home, doing my thing at home, just sat down watching the telly, and the superintendent rang me and said, "Are you aware there's a job at Parbold?" And I said, "I'm not. What is it?" And he said, "We've found a body."
It's hard to understand that such a brutal thing could happen here.
The rural community of Parbold was about to be shocked by what had happened in their peaceful village. April 29, 2019, 18-year-old Alex Davies from Skelmersdale, Lancashire, has disappeared, raising concerns among his family and friends. He was last sighted on CCTV in the village of Parbold before vanishing without a trace. But a grim discovery is made on May 1st. A body has been found in some nearby woods.
I took responsibility for the investigation on the Thursday morning. Alex was found on the Wednesday evening. He was found by a gamekeeper who'd gone to check the traps.
He spotted an arm underneath a pile of conifers.
It was quite clear that there'd been a lot of violence.
The body has been so badly mutilated, they were unable to actually identify not just who it was, but whether it was male or female.
So at that point, I said to my deputy, D.I. Muller, can you open your computer and see what missing from homes we've got locally? He said, they've got a missing from home from Skelmersdale, and he brought up a picture of Alex. I said, let's have a look at him. And I was looking at a picture of Alex, and I'm looking at the body in front of me, and I'm thinking, they don't look the same.
For the family, of course, it's terrible that a body's been found, but there was still that grain of hope that maybe it wasn't Alex, that maybe Alex was still out there somewhere.
His mother must have just been so distressed. On the one hand, she's hoping it's not Alex, but on the other hand, she wants to know what's happened to Alex.
Beverly's worst nightmare becomes a reality when the identification of the body is confirmed.
We had a search team, and suddenly I heard a cry of find from one of the search officers, and they all stopped. It was almost military in precision, really. They just stopped searching, and the Pulsar then took over, and they found what you would call the contents of a wallet, so library card, train card, other cards, bank cards, etc., etc. And they were in the name of Alex Davies. Alex had a little tiny birthmark on his cheek, really just like a little beauty spot, if you will. And in his photograph, he was wearing a silver chain. So I examined the body in front of me, and I thought I could just see a little beauty spot, and the body did have a silver chain on. So at that point, I made the call. I want someone to go around to his mum, who's reported him missing. Tell her, I think we've found him.
It must have been terrible for his mum to know, firstly, that her son had died, that he'd been murdered, and that he was in such a state that they needed to identify him through jewellery. And that moment when they showed her that jewellery, I can't imagine the feeling that must have been in her stomach and in her heart.
It's not just losing a son, it's losing a son in such horrific circumstances.
Alex had multiple stab wounds.
As well as the stab wounds, Alex had injuries to his face, he had a broken nose. It looked like he'd been badly beaten as well as being stabbed.
When I started to look at Alex, I noticed that he had mud up his nostrils and in his mouth. It looked like he'd been dragged face down, and that was awful. And I saw this flat area of land. I started to sort of just assess it as a crime scene. Is that relevant? Very quickly established the grass was flat, and there were lots of bluebells. It was May. Lots of bluebells. They'll always stick in my mind, and a lot of them were flattened, which said to me a lot of activity has happened in that area. So is that where something's happened, and is that where it started, and this where Alex was? Is this where it's ended? So I started to hypothesise what might have happened.
The post-mortem revealed the horrific nature of Alex's death.
He was stabbed 128 times. He had over 146 different injuries to his body.
We know that Alex was still alive when the stab wounds were being inflicted on him because the post-mortem found his cause of death to be asphyxiation, so he'd felt those injuries.
In my career, I can only think of a couple of cases where I've seen injuries that have come anywhere close to that. This is indicating a horrific, sustained, violent attack on him. And it appeared as if the body had been dragged down a slope. placed next to a tree and had foliage put over it in a almost crude attempt to hide the body.
It's hard to fathom the level of force and also the level of rage that must have been involved in an attack like that. What was going through this killer's mind to be so angry and to be so vicious and so violent?
That kind of crime scene with over 100 stab wounds suggests to me a perpetrator who was acting on emotion, loss of emotional control. That's not to say they didn't have control over their decision-making and their actions, but it's someone who couldn't cope with their emotions. Somebody kept going until they were either no longer feeling those emotions in the moment, or they simply tired themselves out.
We had what we call a welfare van. It had equipment so we could make a cup of tea or a coffee. So the CSI said, we're going to go to the welfare van. So they all went off to do their thing, and then I looked at Alex and I thought, I can't leave this young man. His mum wouldn't want me to leave him like this, all on his own. And I don't really know what the catalyst for that was, but I just couldn't leave him. So I just stood at the side of him, quietly. But during that time I was thinking, look at the injuries that this young man's suffered. And I was trying to imagine who would have done it. Who would have been responsible? What kind of person could have been responsible for that kind of horrific attack?
It seems like a real contradiction to have such a gruesome, awful scene, such a horrible crime in such a beautiful, picturesque location. It's night and day. When Alex's body was found, there was an outpouring of love for him, actually. There was a lot of tributes laid at the scene. You know, it was clear that he was a really loved guy. He had a lot of friends and a lot of people who were absolutely devastated that this kind, friendly young man had been killed in such an awful way.
The media were quite keen to understand what was happening, but equally for me as an SIO, I wanted to offer as much reassurance to the public of Parboulder and the wider communities that we were doing everything that we could to sort of understand what had happened and catch the person responsible for killing Alex. If I'm honest, I wanted to get him in the cells as quickly as, so he couldn't do anything else to any other people. I had this thing about, I need to protect the public from this monster.
Now the hunt is on for Alex's killer.
Despite the difficulties of a rural crime scene, severe weather, wind, rain, not to mention animals being present around the crime scene too, the police found a crucial piece of evidence.
In the ground was a small knife that had been pushed into the dirt, just with the handle sticking up.
And that became really important because when we had that forensically examined, it had Alex's blood on it. And then we showed the pathologist the knife, and she could then compare that to the injuries, and it all fell into place. So it was a really, really good find.
There's a saying in murder investigation, to understand how a person died, you have to understand how they lived. And that's because in general, there's some link between someone or something in the victim's life that would indicate why harm has come to them. And that's because most times there's a link between a killer and a victim. So you need to start to build up a picture of the victim's life. And that could be by talking to friends, looking at their social media posts. And importantly now is looking at people's phones. We can build up such a huge picture of someone's life now from their phones. So this is a task that the police were now having to do for Alex, to build up a picture of those hours and days leading up to his murder as to who he was in contact with.
The police began to look into Alex's call logs. Had he contacted anybody that was out of the ordinary? And they did see something different. They saw a number that had contacted him on the day of his murder that had never contacted him before. Police managed to find out that the number that had called Alex had also called a landline. So they called the landline and asked the people there whose phone it was.
And this led them straight to Brian Heelis.
Investigators waste no time and go to the home address of Brian Heelis.
I've got someone who's just brutalised an 18-year-old boy and was still at large. And my sense of duty to protect the public was immense.
But the person they discovered is not who they expected.
And he was just a young fella, absolutely unremarkable in every way, shape and form. Physically, he had no presence. You know, you could almost describe him as grey. You would never notice him in a quiet street, never mind a busy one. There's just nothing about him.
Police need to establish any previous criminal history.
Most people who commit murder have some kind of history with the police. Now, it might not necessarily be violent crime, but they'll be known in some way. He had no criminal history. He wasn't known to the police, so he hadn't been arrested before, hadn't come to notice in any way. So if it was Brian Heelis that had murdered Alex in this brutal way, this is going to be really quite unusual.
The police then understandably searched Heelis's house. Importantly, they found crucial evidence there.
In the CCTV footage of Alex, as he was walking away from that train station, he had a rucksack. And the contents of that rucksack were now found in Heelis's home.
Investigators now need to uncover the sequence of events that led to Alex's death. On 29th April 2019, 18-year-old Alex Davies from Skelmersdale disappeared without a trace in a rural part of Lancashire. His mutilated body was discovered in a wooded area of Parbold Hill a few days later. Investigators have been led to the home of 18-year-old Brian Heelis, who they learned had called Alex on the day he went missing.
When the police were searching Heelis's home, they'll be looking for any clues, any evidence that can link him to either the crime scene or to Alex himself. And that's what they found in his home. They found earphones, mobile phone, and wallet belonging to Alex.
When they found Alex's headphones at Heelis's house, they'd also got the serial number of that exact pair of headphones because Alex had kept the box for them. So they were able to match the serial number on the box to the actual pair of headphones that they found at Heelis's house. You couldn't say that he had a pair that were the same. These were the exact headphones.
We looked at the telephone and we established that that was his granddad's. His granddad had passed. So Alex had said to his uncle, "Can I have granddad's phone that I can keep as a spare in case my battery dies?" So all of a sudden, Brian Heelis has got Alex's spare phone, Alex's headphones, and Alex's wallet. Not only had he got his wallet, he'd taken everything out of Alex's and thrown it at the scene, and he'd put his own ID cards and his own money in it. He was actually using it. We found the knife block with a missing knife. We found a bike, and we found clothing, which was all seized. So the evidence is fairly overwhelming.
So if there was any doubt as to whether or not Heelis was the person that they were looking for, that doubt had gone now. There was no doubt whatsoever in the officer's mind, we have our man.
And now we start the process of gathering evidence from him. So we did the custody procedures, we did the hand swabs, all that kind of thing, and then the interview was going to be key.
Brian Heelis was taken into custody and he was asked a lot of questions about Alex's disappearance and about the murder.
He's been given the same old advice from a solicitor who turns up to represent him. Don't say anything, make the police prove it. First question gets asked, and he's been advised to say no comment. What does he say? No.
Are you responsible for the murder of Alex Davies?
No. That tells me he wanted to talk.
Just step in. Do you recall the advice I gave you in the interview?
Yes.
We'll start again. Are you responsible for the murder of Alex Davies?
No comment.
That's Alex. Have a look at that picture. Do you know Alex?
No comment.
Have you ever seen that person before?
No comment.
How do you know him?
No comment.
With no cooperation from Heelis, investigators need to work hard to build a case against him.
It might be easy to think that once somebody's been arrested and there's some evidence available that it's really easy for the police to prove that they committed the offence. But that's far from the case. They have to prove this beyond reasonable doubt. So in the background there will have been loads of work going on to hone out what the actual evidence was, to make things clear and to see if there was anything else they needed to support a prosecution.
So then they start to look at CCTV in and around the areas Alex had been, and importantly, the route between Helis's home and the crime scene. And what this showed is that he, in actual fact, on the day that Alex went missing, had cycled from Chorley to Parbold. And that footage showed him going there and coming back.
The first time that they see Brian Helis in the area, he's not got anything with him, he's just riding a bike. Later on that day, they see him again riding the bike, but this time he's got a backpack on.
And that rucksack matched the one seen being carried by Alex on the CCTV they had of him. So again, it's more evidence linking Helis not only to Alex, but linking him to his murder.
But how had these two young men encountered each other? And how had Alex ended up murdered on Parbold Hill?
An important element in any murder investigation is the building up of a timeline by laying out known facts and when they happened. And that's what they did in this case. And it started to build a picture that indicated what had happened in the lead up to Alex's murder. What they were able to identify is that Helis and Alex had been communicating on a dating app. And those communications have moved from the dating app to WhatsApp. And they started to talk to each other.
The majority of this was literally the build up to the day that we know that Alex was murdered. So you've got that initial of how are you, do you fancy meeting up, what should we do, etc. Then a few interests. We know that Alex actually was very, very much into his ABBA music, and of course even the Bee Gees. He actually says in one of the messages, do you know who the Bee Gees are? Brian Helis has no idea what he's talking about. So you've got some normal conversations, but a lot of it is flirtatious.
What became clear is that Helis was pushing for a meet, pushing to meet Alex, and he was being what I would describe as manipulative. He was talking himself as, I haven't come out yet as gay, so people don't know. Meaning that when we meet, it needs to be somewhere secluded, somewhere we're not going to get seen. Now we know, looking back, why that was. But for Alex himself, he probably wanted to see the best in the person he was speaking to.
It's not unusual for young people to try and keep their love lives from their parents, regardless of sexuality, but particularly in a situation that perhaps, you know, the mum and dad maybe aren't as open-minded, so it would be a believable story.
Alex's character is so trusting. You know, he's got this wonderful network of friends, he works so much for charity, he believes in people, and I think that was picked up straight away. There's that question of, he just asked us, what phone have you got? And of course, he's got a Samsung 9. And of course, what does he just have? A Samsung 3. Automatically, you can think to yourself, oh, this could be robbery. He wants the better phone. To me, what that's doing is he is trying to go for the sympathy. Oh, I've only got a Samsung 3. And then because you've got this wonderful caring individual in Alex saying, oh, I can look after you there, and I've got a Samsung 9, I can help you out, you're a bit younger than me, so I can be like the older brother, but also in the relationship, I can make sure that I can look after you. So I think you've already seen that Alex even felt that Helis was slightly vulnerable, but he wasn't. He was being duped. He was being lured into this awful trap.
He said, do you think it'd be worth upgrading because mine's so slow? And that was really important, that, because you think, what are you talking about, Jeff? But that's so, you know, the S with a lot of O's. I thought that's unusual. Anyway, when we then do the research on Brian Helis's computer, we see him, after he's had that conversation with Alex, he's researching on eBay how much you can sell Galaxy S9 for, and how to reset a Samsung Galaxy S9, how to avoid being tracked.
Also in the phone messages were the plans of when the two young men would meet. It was scheduled for April 29th, the day that Alex went missing.
And now you start to see the build-up and the arrangements for meeting. Who is in control of this? They've both decided that there will be a meet, but of course what's very interesting here is that you've got Brian Heelis, who's actually turned around and said, I've got a location. So he's now in control of the meet. He knows where it's going to be, what time it's going to be. I'm in control.
Alex must have been excited, looking forward to a nice day out, going on a date, going to meet this new guy who seemed fun and flirty.
It was Heelis that was pushing for this meet. Then he was pushing for it in a secluded area. He took a knife with him. These were indications that this, in actual fact, wasn't a spontaneous event. This was a planned and premeditated murder.
Alex must have been terrified. He'd set out that morning, looking forward to a nice day out, and when it turned so badly and so violent, he must have been terrified. It was exactly what he wasn't expecting that day.
And then obviously they met in the wood. I couldn't speculate. What I do know, there was a violent episode and Brian Heelis battered and then stabbed Alex to death.
When we found Alex, he has multiple injuries. Are you responsible for causing those injuries?
No comment.
Are you responsible for murdering Alex Davis?
No comment.
Brian Heelis's phone held some other disturbing information in the days after Alex had been murdered.
Really worryingly, what they also find is that after Alex has been killed, Heelis is back on the dating apps. He was speaking to multiple other young men. He was trying to arrange meetups. Was he going to do it again? There's every chance that they could have been looking at a serial killer here.
On May 3rd, 2019, police arrest 18-year-old Brian Heelis for the brutal murder of Alex Davies in a secluded area of Parbold Hill. Alex had been stabbed 128 times by Heelis, whom he met on a dating site. Police discovered the details of how Heelis lured Alex to the woods in Parbold that day, and now they have incriminating evidence on Heelis's phone to suggest that he was planning to kill again.
Killed Alex on the Tuesday afternoon, and then on the Wednesday and Thursday he'd made contact with a man in Skelmersdale about a sexual encounter. Brian Heelis had sort of indicated that he could stay over at this address, and the other person said, not likely, you know, we'll do what we need to do and then you're away, mate. So that didn't seem to fit what Heelis wanted. But then he made contact with another guy in the Bolton area, so the other side of Chorley, and really unusual because he asked this guy what kind of phone he had, and he said, oh, I've got a Huawei P Lite, and he said, I've got rubbish, whatever it is it worth upgrading because mine is so slow? And they arranged to meet, and he said, as he said with Alex, it will be the first time I've kissed anybody, so I'm a bit shy. Is there somewhere discreet we can go? And the other person had said, well, there's a wooded area near mine, we can go there. And then we arrested him on the Friday night. He was going to meet him the following day.
We'll never know whether that was for the same purpose. But it's not exactly a leap, is it, to go from, I've just killed one person in this route, and now I'm trying to meet another. There's a very good chance that they prevented him carrying out a second murder.
There were other signs that Heelis may not have stopped after the murder of Alex.
He'd been doing searches on army spades, as it were. They're the fold-up spades, so you can carry them in a rucksack. Why would you be doing that when we know those actual items for the army are used to actually dig very quickly little troughs or little holes in the ground? So is this all this learning curve for this sociopath, psychopath, who is now actually living his dream, which is gets the anger and he wants to kill? And now he's planning the future. Well, I've got to dispose of the body a lot better. So perhaps it's actually not worked that out. If I do this, what do I do with the body? And that's hit him when it's happened. He's dragged it, tried to cover it up. It didn't work. And now already he's planning for the next one.
So when we look at the circumstances of what happened after Alex's murder, can any sort of inference be drawn from the fact that Helis had taken Alex's property and still had it with him in his bedroom? Well, it's difficult, in all honesty, to 100% say one way or the other. But what he would have been able to do, he had the opportunity to do, is to throw away that property, to dump it on his route home, put it in a bin, throw it in a bush. He didn't do that, he took it home. Why would he do that? Well, one of two reasons, really. One, it's a shiny object I want to keep. It's a phone, it's got value. Or, and more sinister, it's some kind of trophy, a reminder of what he's done. And if we're talking about an emotional attack where someone's carrying it out because of that, what these killers will often do is keep almost like a memento from their crime to remind them of the attack and almost sort of to draw out that emotion again at some later time.
They couldn't rule out the fact that they might be looking at somebody with a real vengeance, and having killed one person, you could do it again.
The trial for the murder of Alex Davies is held at Preston Crown Court in March 2020.
There was quite a lot of press there for the trial. It was an intriguing case. At that point, all that we knew was that Alex had disappeared. His body had been found on Parbold Hill, and the boy had been arrested. At that stage, we didn't know the background about the dating app. We didn't know the extent of Alex's injuries. So when the prosecution opened the case, it was really quite a shock to learn what had happened that day. When Brian Helis walked into the dock, he just looked like you might see him outside the local sixth form college. He was very emotionless. His face barely moved. There was no sign of any sort of remorse or anything. He was an odd character in that regard. By the time the prosecution's finished opening the case, it seems fairly cut and dried. They had so much evidence, the headphones, the backpack, all the phone evidence, all the CCTV evidence. It was difficult to think what Helis could possibly say to try and get out of this one.
Murder investigations teams put a huge amount of effort into gathering the evidence against any killer. And you can go to court and you can feel like we've done everything. We've got all the evidence we have. I'm in absolutely no doubt that a person standing trial has committed this crime. But that does not mean that you go to court confident that the verdict's going to be one of guilty, because it has to go through a jury. And you can never take for granted the decision a jury are going to make. So as confident as you are, you can never go into a trial expecting to get a guilty verdict.
Helis's defence was diminished responsibility. There was reports from psychiatrists that backed that up, actually. He had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and his defence was that he'd committed this offence while suffering with that condition. Helis said that he thought that people were after him and that was why he was carrying a knife that day. And he said that while he was on his way to meet Alex, he thought that there was people trying to knock him off his bike in their cars. And yeah, he was painting a picture of real paranoia.
What happens when a defendant looks to use a defence of diminished responsibility is that they will be seen by their own psychiatrist, appointed by their own legal team. And they will assess them as to whether or not that defence, partial defence of diminished responsibility, is open to them. And that's what happened in this case. And this psychiatrist said, yes, In my opinion, Helis has a defence of diminished responsibility because he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. But then what would happen is the prosecution would appoint their own psychiatrist to carry out the same assessment. If they agree with the previous assessment, yes, the defence is open to them. The likelihood is that the Crown Prosecution Service will accept that. If they disagree, then they will go to trial. And it wouldn't be on the facts of whether or not the incident took place. It would be what was in the mind of the defendant, what was in the mind of Helis at the time it was being committed.
It seems that it was agreed that paranoid schizophrenia was a relevant diagnosis for Helis, but there's still the question, did it cause the murder? Does it result in diminished responsibility?
You've got the days beforehand of the chat. You've got the whole thing that's been planned to meet an individual. So he knows he's going to meet an individual and he takes a knife with him and then immediately goes into the anger and attacks Alex. This is your classic premeditation. The fact that he's planned everything to meet Alex in a secluded spot, even controls the location and kills Alex. So it's not spontaneous, where they've had a relationship, something's broken down and he's picked up a weapon and used it, and then what do I do? He's actually, and diminished responsibilities would mean he's got no idea what he's doing. Well, just look at the chat logs, look at the control he's doing. So without a doubt, he has thought out the whole thing here.
After the trial had concluded and the judge had made his comment, sent the jury out, we were waiting.
Despite having complex issues like a defence of diminished responsibility to navigate, the jury took only an hour to decide. They knew what the outcome was going to be, and he was found guilty of murder.
In the UK, there's only one sentence for murder, and that is one of life imprisonment. But in the UK, life doesn't always and rarely means life. A judge will set a minimum tariff, meaning the defendant will have to serve this amount of prison time before they can apply for parole. In this instance, the judge passed a sentence of a minimum of 24 years, meaning it would be that long before Helis could apply for parole.
But Brian Helis is yet to see the inside of a prison.
Because of his mental health conditions, he has never actually gone into a prison. He's detained now at a psychiatric unit, a secure psychiatric unit on the outskirts of Preston. I think for Alex's family, it's got to be hard to know that the young man that killed Alex has never been inside a prison cell. They feel that there's a lack of justice there, that for everything that he did, he's never really paid the price.
I'm in no doubt Helis is and probably always will be a dangerous individual. To go from no offending history to an attack of this ferocity really suggests someone, and I don't use this word lightly, is evil. 24 years would mean he'll be roughly in his early 40s before he could be released. So still a relatively young person, young enough to start his own family, to start a life, something that Alex will never have.
Loads of people use dating websites perfectly safely, but the difficulty with that is we can be lulled into a false sense of security. We need to remember that we're messaging someone who you've no idea in reality who they are, what they like. They might be telling you one thing, but the truth is something else completely.
Bev, Alex's mother, said, well, yes, she was aware that her son was using them, even to the extent they had the conversation that his mother was aware of some horrendous cases involving some online sexual predators who had gone on to murder. Alex said, that's okay, that will never happen to me.
Online dating's the world that we live in now, isn't it? That's how people meet. You know, I think certainly a high number of relationships start online these days. I think there's always advice out there. If you're going to meet somebody, meet them in public, tell a friend where you're going, all of those kind of things. Because really, until you've met, you can never really be sure that somebody is who they say they are.